I've been waiting for this day. Now, when I say I've been waiting for this for a very long time, I really do mean that, because this is the Sabre Apex Prime. This blaster was provided to us for free for review from Out of Darts, so special thanks to them. Now, when I first heard about Sabre, I was a little intrigued by it and I always wanted to get one, but the price tag was always pretty much out of my reach for one reason or another. Whether I couldn't afford it or I couldn't justify spending so much money on a singular blaster, which in some cases wasn't even fully complete. But now that we have the Sabre Apex Prime, we can really get a feel for it and see if that cost is justified. In a lot of ways, I think it is, but in some others, not so much. The Sabre Apex Prime is a pump action springer, but it does not come with a foregrip nor a main grip, but this is the stock configuration. So ahead of this really long barrel, you have a 6-string scar, which you do have to string yourself. You have a semi-fixed stock, but it can be removed. It's not really compatible with anything else. We'll talk more about that later. And this is compatible with Talon magazines. This blaster is almost all full metal with a couple machined Delrin parts, so it's very high quality. The main draw to this, no pun intended, is that the Prime is very smooth, and so is a trigger pull. The included barrel and spring combo can push this thing to about 270 FPS, but with heavyweight darts, it can drop to as low as 230. Now, when talking about this blaster, I don't really want to compare it to normal springers that we have, because this feels more like maintaining the car than anything. Now, what I mean by that is some of the screws near the priming block can come loose and the foregrip gets really wobbly, and that actually does hurt the smoothness of the Prime. But if you really want to, you could actually remove this entire block and replace it with a side Prime handle instead, which is actually included, and that'll actually make the Prime very, very smooth. But most people don't like side primes, so that's kind of up to you. After using it for a little bit like that, I did kind of get used to it, but I still just prefer a normal pump grip. Up top, you have a full Picatinny rail, and this is one of the rare cases where I feel like you actually do need to get an optic for this, because I tried shooting it without an optic and I was barely able to hit anything. That doesn't mean the blaster's inaccurate, it's actually very accurate. Now, the reason why I had some trouble aiming this was because this blaster is actually very heavy. I couldn't get a good weight on the scale, but it weighs somewhere around 7 pounds, which honestly is comparable to a real steel. So if you want something that feels a little bit more real, if you catch my drift, this is not a bad option. In terms of upgradability, the barrel and the spring can be swapped out for something a little bit more powerful. Now, currently we don't have the parts to push this to its absolute limit, but I've heard of users getting these up to about 400 FPS, which is pretty respectable. But having a high FPS really isn't everything. Now, it's kind of hard to talk about this blaster because in a way it wasn't really meant for me. And the reason I say that is because I'm more of a CQB player. And for something that's tight corners and really high action, I feel like this doesn't really fit that playstyle. Now, I understand you can downgrade the spring and downgrade the barrel if you want to get lower FPS to get that, but you still have a very heavy blaster, essentially. And while I could probably get used to it, it just isn't really right for me. Which actually brings me to what is probably my biggest gripe about this blaster, and it's actually the stock, because it'll do that if you put the right amount of pressure on it. And the reason why it does that is because this is what houses the spring. So if you want to change the spring out, you have to remove this piece. And while I appreciate the ability to quick swap the spring, I just don't feel like it should be tied to the stock. And another thing I'm not too terribly crazy about is the quality control on this. Now, from what I understand, Sabre has addressed this and they are fixing it with future batches, but the issue that I had specifically is that some of the screw holes weren't drilled in quite all the way. So there's a couple screws that won't really go in right. And it seems like the alignment of some of the parts is a little off for the assembly, but for the most part, it actually wasn't too terrible. There's a general conception that when you spend so much money on a blaster, especially one at this price tag, that there's certain things that can't be overlooked. But at the same time, this sort of thing isn't really offered by different people. And while I'm sure this thing can take a serious beating, I would certainly worry about these main shell pieces getting scratches, because I feel like scratches would be a very prominent thing with this. But in terms of overall damage to the blaster, I think it should be able to survive it no problem. Now, to go over the parts that we used specifically for this, we actually have a worker Seagull grip as the pump. I just personally prefer this foregrip because it's a little bit smaller, and that's just my jam. And for the main priming grip, we actually just used this 3D printed file that GameFace uses for the try-on, and it works pretty good. Another thing people might be not too crazy about is the magwell is a little bit loose, but I've also heard from certain users that the magwell is too tight, so I don't know if that's just a difference in quality control. But when everything's held together, aside from the trigger, there's not really a whole lot of wobbly parts or anything like that. Just make sure all your screws are tight. So overall feelings about the Sabre Apex Prime, while I do like it for some aspects, I feel like it does have some problems that are very difficult to ignore. Honestly, there's not really going to be much of a chance to use this, at least in its current configuration, at any of our local games. And the fear of it looking a little bit too real steel might be an issue in some places. But there's no denying, it is absolutely gorgeous and it is a wonderful piece to have. No doubt about that in my mind. Once again, special thanks to Out of Darts for sending this blaster in for a review. We really appreciate it. It's really nice to have. And if you would like to purchase an Apex Prime, please use the affiliate link down below. As always, stay safe and happy foam flinging.